Hello, everybody. This is NGO Soul+Strategy. As you know, one of the themes that I am particularly interested in at this moment in time is how we can enrich the field of leadership study, but also practice in civil society by looking at leadership practices and models, philosophies that originate outside of the West or the global North. And Albert Anoubon Momo and I both share a board position at the same nonprofit, Cadasta. Albert is board chair, and I'm one of its members, and I'm the head of the governance committee. So we've been working together for quite a while now, Albert and I. And when Albert told me recently that he had written a book called Leadership Lessons from African Cultures, a Journey of Wisdom and Resilience, you can guess what I said to him. You must come on the show. So Albert, with his worldview, as well as his lived experiences, is able to bridge several worlds of leadership practice. So I was excited to interview him. So welcome, Albert.
Thank you, Tosca. It's a pleasure to be here with you.
It's really nice to be speaking with each other in a different identity than the board identity, the board role.
Absolutely.
Isn't it? So, dear listeners, for people who don't know Albert, he was the vice president until recently and executive director of for emerging markets and funded projects at the Trimble company, or Trimble Foundation, I should say. He now owns his own company. He's in the process of rolling that out, in which he will offer geospatial consulting in emerging markets. And geospatial, the sector is completely not one of mine, so I don't claim to have any expertise there. But to give you a sense, when he worked at Trimble, Trimble is an American software, hardware, and service technology company that supports global industries with land surveying, mapping, building in building and construction sectors, agriculture, natural resources, and utilities, and works with governments as well. So a very deep expertise in geospatial matters, which is relevant for Cadasta. Before that, Albert was the director of institutional business development at Trimble, and he also was a management and program analyst at USAID, and he played multiple roles before that again as senior geoscientist and GIS and software engineer, including at the American National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration inside the US government. So, Albert, your book, Leadership Lessons from African Cultures. Tell us a little bit about your identity first and how your identity relates to the fact that you felt the need to write this book.
Yes, thank you, Tosca. So I was born in Cameroon, in Central Africa, and I grew up there. I actually went to school there. I had my first graduate degrees. They have master degrees or in Cameroon. And I moved to the US a little bit more than 25 years ago.
Okay.
So I've been in the US for 25 years and plus. And of course, I went back to school here. So I had other advanced degrees here in the US. But I've been working in this country for many years. And fortunately, I've been in a lot of leadership positions, being with the government or the private sector. And in most of the positions that I held, I was involved not only here in the US, but also a lot international.
Yeah.
And I visited something like 123 countries
Wow.
around the world. And because of being in a position where I have to deal with governments all around the world, but also with employees all around the world, I developed a taste of leadership through different lenses. So originally, I wanted, and I still have that plan, I wanted to write a book that will educate people on how to handle employees from various parts of the world. Because the way you deal with people in Brazil is not the same way you should deal with people in India, and definitely how you should deal with people in the US. But we always have this one-fit-all approach where we try to impose our will to people, and usually it's very difficult when you manage those people. But in the process of writing that book, I still have a lot of the material. I felt like maybe I should focus only on Africa. I consider myself a student of leadership. I read a lot of books in leadership, and I try to apply what I read. And the one thing that I always noticed was lacking is a general idea of how culture impact leadership. And because I think I understand African cultures very well, I say maybe I should actually bring African cultures to people who are either leaders or aspiring leaders, or people who are like myself, students of leadership. What can they learn from African cultures? And for the past 2-3 years, I really focus on preparing that information. And that's, the raison d'être of this book is actually to try to for people to understand that there are so many things that they can learn from African cultures that will improve the leadership skills.
Yes, yes, because let's face it, when you said many times many people try to use one model and for leadership, and that model, let's face it, has been heavily imprinted by American literature, American models, American data, sometimes global data, but often with a heavy Western or global North focus. That has been changing a little bit, but it still needs to undergo more change, right, in my view.
Yes.
And in the nonprofit and NGO and civil society sectors, we are really, I think, very eager to learn about non-Western forms of leadership models and practices that frankly can enrich all of our lives. So your book explores leadership lessons from African cultures. Could you share a key principle or two of African leadership? And we'll talk in a moment about the fact that this is a huge continent with a lot of diversity within it, right? Which we need to talk about as well. But could you share a key principle of African leadership that you believe nonprofit leaders globally could benefit from adopting?
So there are I would consider three pillars that I will put out there for people to integrate. The first one is resilience. And because I'm answering your question with the non-profit organizations in mind, resilience is very important. It's important for African cultures, but I know it's also important for NGOs, right? Most of them operate in environments that are not as stable as the environment that, like a private organization will operate. They know, I have to sell products and things of that nature. With NGOs, they have to raise funds, they have to go through a lot of hurdles in order to accomplish what they plan to accomplish. So resilience is one of the pillars that I think African culture can really help with leadership in NGOs. The second one is empathy, right? The first thing that you notice, and of course, African is 54 countries, 1,000 tribes, right? So when I say, and that's why I always say African cultures with S, right? So that people understand that there's no such thing as African culture. But in every African cultures, empathy is something that is at the center of the relationships between people. And I think NGOs also, by definition, are trying to help. No matter what their missions are, at the end of the day, they're trying to help a group of people. They're trying to help organizations. So having empathy for me is also an important element that leaders in NGOs should learn from African cultures. The third one is not only African, is universal, but it's worth to mention it, is integrity.
Integrity.
Yes, integrity. And integrity in NGOs has a different meaning than integrity in the, and I'm sorry to always bring back the private sector because that's where I'm coming from.
Good, it's
But
interesting.
yeah, so it's integrity in the private sector is different from integrity in NGOs. People have to trust you when you are an NGO, right? People have to trust that the mission that you have, the values that you promote are things that you live by.
Mm.
In the private sector, you want people to know that you do the right thing, that you are not, that you're following the rules. In NGOs, you don't only have to do the right thing, but you also have to do things right all the time.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
integrity is a key factor, you know, when you're a leader of NGOs. You want people to trust you. And you not only, you have to earn the trust, you have to keep earning the trust. And integrity is the way to do that.
Okay, so those three pillars you think are important for nonprofits. Just a follow-up question on resilience. Why do you think that is one pillar of African leadership cultures, right? Why is resilience so important?
So, and you will see that in my book. You have to look at the history of Africa, right? For a long time, Africa was described as a continent that was discovered, you know, the same way we say, you know, America was discovered, right? But there is a pre-colonial Africa.
Right.
There's a pre-colonial Africa of a lot of tribes living mostly in autarky, but you know, interacting. Some of them were interacting with each other, and they were actually big empires in Africa. You know, you may have heard of the Ghana Empire, you have heard of the Niger Empire. So they were big empires in Africa,
Very
and
sophisticated cultures.
exactly, and with a lot of rules. Like the first university was actually in Timbuktu, right? But we don't know that. We always think that scholars are all coming from the Western world. So there was a pre-colonial Africa.
Yeah.
And till this day, people haven't still don't understand how colonization has impacted Africa.
Hmm.
And in this, I want to talk about almost every single country in Africa has been impacted by colonization, right? You know, there are very few countries in Africa that are using their own language to communicate between themselves. The official languages in most African countries are English, French, Portuguese, Arabic, and for one country, Spanish. And now, you know, of course, in South Africa, they add Afrikaans, they add Swahili, they add, and in some other Western and Southern Africa countries, they add, you know, Swahili. But mostly the communication between people in the same country in Africa is with a foreign language. And yes, they learned those languages through colonization, but there was much more things that they have to suffer because of colonization and, of course, because of slavery. So Africa defined itself from the wounds that they had through slavery and through colonization. And the perception of African leadership is really very impacted by the result of colonization, slavery, and all the isms that are coming after, you know, the neocolonizations and neocolonialism and every other things that, you know, Africa is still facing.
Yes.
Thus the resilience, right? Because still people live there. Still people are happy. Still people are trying to fight for a better future.
Yeah.
And that's the resilience part.
Notwithstanding. Yes, understood. Now, as we already said, it's a huge continent, right? Many countries, many different cultures. Can you outline for us where it comes to leadership models, approaches, etc.? Do you see different versions, varieties, emphasis, etc., between different sub-regions within the continent? Did you want to lay out for us?
Absolutely. So actually in the book, I had, in 10 chapters where I pick a tribe and look at leadership through the lenses of that tribe. The first one that comes to mind, because is very is known, is the Ubuntu notion from Zulu people,
Yeah,
right? And Ubuntu is really a theory that I hope, especially again in the NGOs environment, people should embrace, right? I am because you are.
right.
That's the theory behind Ubuntu. Like, and now in America, I say, I'm my brother keeper, I'm a sister keeper. That's what Ubuntu is all about.
Mm-hmm.
When you have an NGO, what you try to do is help other people. And I was talking about empathy, but helping other people is defining yourself as part of them. And you see them as part of you.
That interdependence that we share. We
Exactly.
are
That
dependent
interdependent.
on each other for happiness, for well-being, and for the future of this world.
Absolutely. So your mission exists because there are people that you try to impact. If those people are not there, you don't have a mission anymore. You are not supposed to exist as an NGO. There is also, and something that is common to many of the tribes that I described, is the wisdom of the elders, right?
Mm-hmm.
So we learn a lot from people who were there before us. And I don't want elders here to only be seen as someone older than you in age. It can be also someone with more experience than you, someone that you can learn from. And I think the fact that many of those cultures recognize the importance of the people, the knowledge that you can tap into,
Yeah,
of people who have something that they can share, is
yeah,
also something that I want to highlight.
yeah.
And now, one thing that is not very known, if you look at the history of civilizations, the few civilizations, from the ages, that from almost, I would say, the beginning, empower women are actually in Africa. One of the biggest empire in Africa, the Congo Empire, was led by a woman. And we all know about, Egyptian, right? That,
Mm-hmm.
they had a woman as she was not called Pharaoh, but she was the leader of Egypt. But we always feel like, in general, in Africa, women are second-class citizens.
Not just in Africa, but yes, amongst others. That's
In many
the
places.
general sense. Yeah.
Because now when we talk about empowering women, what actually happened is that people went away from what the core of their cultures was. And the core of many African cultures is actually about women as an important and most of the time equal partner of men. So when I was doing the research for the book, I really discovered that importance of women, and I try to highlight this in the book.
Mm-hmm.
Also, actually, for African people who try to stay away from that, thinking that the women empowerment is something that the Western are trying to impose at them, which is actually not the case.
That's
It's
very ironic.
actually the other way around. Yeah.
Yes, because
So,
often the accusation will be made that those are Western values that are heterogeneous to, in this case, African
yeah,
culture, right?
absolutely.
Interesting. Yeah. Yeah. So you talk in the book a lot about communalism, and it's interesting because I've interviewed several other people in last year about this, and they often will mention communalism and Ubuntu interdependence. I am because you are as important features. You mention in the book the role of elders. the emphasis on cultural preservation. You mentioned oral culture, so storytelling, proverbs, and narratives as being an important part of transferring wisdom, not just knowledge, but wisdom, actually,
Wisdom,
right?
absolutely.
Yes, yes. So, but within the continent, do you see different variations? Because we say it's a big continent, but we're still talking right now at the level of a continent. Do you see important differences in emphasis in different subregions that we should be aware of, particularly those of us who come from the global north?
Yes, and unfortunately, those differences are mostly impacted by the external influence. And, in the book, I actually have a place where I talk about, external influences. And it's not, I'm not trying to criticize, right? But because we are the product of all the influences that we bring. So the northern part of Africa will have a huge, Islamic influence.
Yeah.
So the way the leadership is shaped there is linked to that Islamic influence. And you will have that in Northern Africa and also, in the Sahel region, right?
Yes.
The importance of the Islamic roots. In most coastal of Western and Central Africa, of course, the Christianism have affected the way the leadership is shown by various leaders there, and the influence also of the country that colonized them.
Yeah.
And when you go to Africa, Western and Central Africa, being in a French-speaking country or being in an English-speaking country, you can see the difference. You can see the difference, and it comes from how they were colonized, right? British Empire used what they call indirect rule, so which a little bit empower the kings. They were called thrones in some regions. So those kings within the British Empire were already considered important people. And the way the British people were going through the public was through those kings.
Yes.
So there were leaders already, and some of them end up actually being, head of state or very important people in the post-colonization country, post-independence countries. In French, it was the direct rule.
Mm-hmm.
And kings that they found there were actually seen in many cases in French colonial Africa as enemies. And some of them were actually killed or imprisoned by French people.
I see. Because they
And
were
now,
seen to be a threat to the official hierarchical power of the French colonial regime?
yes.
Okay.
And now you will see that in French-speaking African countries, there is something in French called Jacobinism, right? The Jacobinism is replicated there, where everything has to go through the head, who is the president of the republic. So it's easy to create a dictatorship there, because what they learn from French colonialism is the one head and everybody is under that head. Whereas in the British Empire, there were, those kings that were used as conduit for the rules of the king or the queen, for that matter.
Yeah, yeah. So interesting. Yeah,
In the southern part of Africa, the fact that you have many countries that speak the same language, Swahili in this case, you have many people. Swahili, after I think Arab, is the most spoken language in Africa. So there is an identity that you can see in Eastern and Southern Africa from sharing the same language and sharing a lot of cultural traits, including the Ubuntu concept that we just talked about.
Yeah.
People think that Ubuntu is only South Africa. They may not have the same names outside of South Africa, but Ubuntu principles, you can see that in Tanzania, in Kenya, in Uganda, because they're sharing those traits, all over countries where you speak Swahili.
Right, right. So it's Southern plus Eastern Africa at the very least. Yeah. Now, so you've worked in American companies. You're the board chair of a nonprofit, Candasta, that focuses on making land documentation and indirectly land rights accessible to poor people in a very participatory manner. What do you think, particularly American culture is generally, and we're generalizing here, and as a European, I certainly also experienced it living in America, it's a very individualistic culture, right? More individualistic than Western Europe, at least in my experience, and then quite a few other regions in the world. So what can a culture like American culture or other Western cultures that are similar to that, what can it learn, what should it learn from the African leadership models that you have discussed in your book?
So the communalism is one thing that you mentioned. And I think more and more, especially for the past four years, leaders in America understand that it's not only about the bottom line, it's not only about the investors or Wall Street, it's more and more about the people. And you will hear leaders always talking about, you are the most important asset of the company. You, the people, are the more important asset of the company.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of them believe what they say. And that's why they should actually learn even more from African cultures, where that idea of communalism, of, we share a common future. We share, my decision affects you. And I have to, so I have to take that into consideration when I make that decision. And I know, people will end up doing, layoff and all that stuff. But now you can do that in a more humanistic manner. You can create foundation within your company. You can give more time to people. You can consider mental health of people. That there are so many things, and those are elements of African cultures.
Exactly.
They don't reject people. When you are at your low, they embrace you and they help you, get back to where you're supposed to be. So that, yeah.
I was going to say, in a way, I see a convergence.
Yes.
I see a convergence between, in the past, we had a predominance, as we said, of Western models of leadership. But as you were just sketching so well, now there's much more of the pendulum swinging more towards people factors, right? Shared humanity, shared leadership, right? Shared future, solidarity, empathy, a focus on people management, and that people are the organization's most important asset, as you said. So I see, in a way, different worlds coming together and influencing each other in a very potentially beneficial way, so that we have a richer leadership approach coming out of that. Does that make sense to you?
Completely. And I 100% agree with you. And that's what the world is about. We have to learn from each other. We have to take what is good from other places and build I don't want to say we have to build a common world culture, but we have, even as individual, we want to be able to take what is good elsewhere, especially in our own leadership journey, right? As a leader, what is it that I can take from A, B, C, D and make me a better leader, a compassionate leader?
Let me build on that then, Albert, and ask you, so we just talked about what global North-based leaders can learn from African cultures, and we'll talk some more about that in a moment. But what's the reverse? So what, you having lived in America for so long now, 25 years, and worked there at a leadership level for all those years, what can the various the African cultures and leadership cultures that you have described in the book, what can they in turn learn from the global North in terms of how leadership is enacted?
To be And that's probably the first thing that I'm going to say, to be a better custodian of whatever you are in charge of.
What do you mean?
What I mean with that is you are okay, let me go back to private sector and probably use NGO. You are the leader or the head of a company.
Yeah.
Here, because of the nature of the job here, you know that you keep your job because you have the bottom line. You work on the bottom line. You have to make sure that you increase revenues, that you increase benefits, that the investors are getting their money back, that the shareholders are getting their money back. So you have to be a good custodian of what you manage.
Yeah, yeah.
Unfortunately, and I'm sorry that I have to a little bit generalize when I'm saying it's not always seen that way in Africa. Because a lot of companies are state-owned companies.
Yeah.
So when you are the general manager, you don't feel as an obligation for the company to operate with the best efficiency. You are at the head of that company because you are close to the president, to the minister, or whoever the case may be.
Yeah.
So sometimes you don't always have the best interest of that company at heart. Let me now go to the NGOs. And I'm talking about NGOs in Africa or African NGOs.
Okay.
Sometimes you feel like whoever is sending me money, it can be an international organization, it can be the main NGOs outside of the continent, it can be a philanthropist. You don't always feel the need to be accountable. You don't always feel the need to produce results, to evaluate the impact of your actions. That's the one thing I think they should learn from the Western culture, because in Western culture, the accountability is always the key.
Yeah.
And that's not always the case in African cultures.
I see. Interesting. I'm going to come back to that later, but I want to ask you something. You also write in a book about conflict resolution methods being different and valuable, the way you are describing especially the role of elders in different cultures, right? What can we learn? How do those conflict resolution methods differ from Western ones? And how could they usefully be applied in a nonprofit setting?
In Africa, conflict resolution is embedded in the culture. So they know from the beginning that conflict will arise. So they have people, it can be called council of elders, for example, in some of those cultures. That mission is actually to resolve conflict.
The main purpose.
The main purpose of the group is to resolve conflict. And the way they resolve conflict is not by saying you won, you lost, you right, you wrong, right? They always want let me call it for the sake of the conversation, they always want the litigant to be part of the solution, to be part of the company, and to shake hands, to be part of the same community.
Okay.
And that's the main difference with here. In Western culture, it's about a trial, I would say, like who is wrong, who is right. And of course, usually there's always a gray area. There's not always someone who's 100% right and someone who's 100% wrong. But the way the conflict, the conflict mitigation is approached here is basically to find who's wrong, who's right, who should be fixed, who should fix A, who should fix B. In Africa, it's more about how can we come back to a common ground? How can we amend our relationship so that we can continue working together? We can continue doing things together. And I think that's something people can learn from African cultures here in Western civilization. Like if the CEO and the CFO have a misunderstanding, it doesn't mean that one of them has to resign.
Mm.
They can always find a common ground. They can always find someone who will talk to both of them, because usually it's exactly what I say, is misunderstanding. Usually the two people have the company best interest in mind, but they have different visions. They have different ways of coming to the goal of making the company better. So having someone who will help them find that common ground, find ways to collaborate better, to work better, for
Yeah.
me is something that is very useful.
Useful. Yes. So I hear you talk about it's a more effective way of resolving conflict through finding common ground, share goals, win-win, rather
Yeah,
than a win-lose proposition,
absolutely.
or a mini win, mini loss kind of compromise. Yeah. Now, I do want to, before we bring this to a close, complicate things a little bit further by asking you, of course, no national or regional culture is static, right? All cultures undergo change all the time, right? And of course, globalization is one, not the only one, but major force underlying it, your generational changes, etc., and values. So the African leadership cultures that you described so well in the book are undergoing change as well. Urbanization, a very important factor. You talk about it in the book, right? Yeah. How do you see that lived out? So how are leadership cultures, norms, and practices changing as a result of the fact that the continent is urbanizing, it is ever more integrated into the rest of the globe. It is in some ways rising, right, as an economic, social, and cultural force. So what does that all mean for leadership practices? Do you see them change? Do you see values change?
And they have to. I mean, it's something that we cannot stop.
Right.
Globalization is here to stay.
Yeah.
So for me, people just have to be more intentional. You have to read Maxwell like everybody else, right? Maxwell is one of the pop of leadership. Read him, see from his teachings what you can get, and improve your own leadership journey, improve your own leadership skills. So yes, Africa is probably the continent that is going through the most
Yeah.
changes, and like year after year, month after month, you can see things changing. And the global world is coming to Africa, and they're coming to Africa usually with their own values, with their own mindset. So it's up to Africans to also bring what they have to that commonality, to that common world.
Mm.
And that's why I wrote that book. I want people to say, oh, there is actually something I can learn from Africa. And I
Yeah.
want African leaders to also be able to sit at that table and say, oh, this is what we can bring, but be really open to receive what others are also bringing to the table.
At the same
And
time.
not feeling like they are just consuming theories or values from other people.
Mm.
They have to because of globalization, but they just need to bring their own stuff. And are we going to end up in a world that is where everything is the same everywhere?
Much.
Definitely no, because there will always be, I have a little bit more of this or a little less of that. I have a
Yeah.
little bit more of this, but at the end of the day, the globalization will make the world a little bit more homogeneous.
Yes, yes, interesting. One more kind of complexity factor, if you will, is so the book highlights a lot of the strengths, understandably, that are reflected in African leadership principles and what the rest of the world, as you just said again, can learn a lot about. There's also limitations or challenges, right? That African founded leadership approaches can pose limitations and challenges. Yeah. And at the same time, I want to say sometimes people romanticize certain leadership models, particularly, frankly, white liberals from the global north sometimes have that proclivity, I think. We see at this moment in the world's time, we see lots of tribalism in the US. It's not exactly the way it looks like in certain African countries, but it's tribalism still. It's a kind of a circling of the wagons around own identity, right? We see that in many other countries in the global north. We have seen it in Africa also, of course. So we see examples of tribalism, we see violence, we see misogyny sometimes, right? We see that all over the world. We also see it in Africa. So how do you explain, in the case of the African continent, the parallel existence of the beautiful aspects of African leadership that you have put out in the book and talked to us about, as well as the existence of other forms, expressions of leadership that are much more about power hungry, undemocratic, etc. Again, I'm not saying that that is unique to Africa. Look at this country right now, American politics, where we're at, and the sore state of democracy, right? But still, how do you explain that parallel existence of beauty, of leadership principles, and sometimes some ugly opposites thereof in terms of the African continent? Is that colonialism as the most important factor? Are there other factors also in the mix?
It's a combination. And no, I won't blame colonization, because there was not a unified way of, colonizing Africa. There is, and we see that now all over the world, the notion of a strong man.
Mm-hmm.
We see that in various places. I think
Including
when somebody thinks that I can get away with things, I can command people, and I can manipulate the masses to follow me.
Mm-hmm.
And if they are in a position where there is no way to confine them, through the rule of the law, through, whatever we have in democracy that prevent someone from becoming a dictator.
Right.
There is this notion that people will take all the power that they can take.
Yeah.
And we've been seeing that in Africa for a long time.
Yeah.
Post-independence Africa was filled of countries with a strongman at the head.
Mm-hmm.
And then, in the early 1990s, there was a push for more democracy, right? After the fall of the Soviet Union. But unfortunately, we still have people who were able to manipulate the masses, and sometimes actually to use democracy to push for dictatorship, right? Like when someone becomes president through a coup and then tells you that the people want him. I don't know when people sat and say, you know what, we want a military to be our head, and we want a coup to be what is good for the country.
Yeah.
I'm not saying that they don't have any popularity at all.
Right.
But at the end of the day, if you want to be the leader of people, we need to find a way for people to embrace you as their leader.
Mm-hmm.
And you need to have their future, you need to have them at the core of your actions. I try not to use the word democracy because they're going to say, okay, that's too Western. But you need to find a way for people to feel like this leader that we have, I'm embracing him. I'm willingly following him because I think he has my best interest in mind. And unfortunately, in Africa, just like in many parts of the world now, there is more and more a push for people, for strongmen to be at the helm of countries and to become dictators. Let's just call it the way they are.
Yes, yes. And particularly at this time again in global history where a lot of people, a lot of us feel threatened in some ways in our existence, in our identity. There's a lot of societal change, a lot of change in norms, of course, immigration, and all these things make people more prone to, all over the world, to go back to a hankering for a strong man type of political leader. That is no different in other regions of the world than it
And
is.
one thing that I want to add, Tosca, is it's so easy to point fingers. And so we talk about tribalism, xenophobia, and all those things. It's easy as a leader, it's easy as a political man to push for that, because it's easy to tell people that other people who doesn't look like you, what that other person who doesn't look like you is the reason you're suffering.
Yes, exactly. The othering
Mm.
of other people. Yes, it seems to be a human, a global human phenomena or need. It's a sad thing. So to finish up, Albert. So if I go back to nonprofits and nonprofits and NGO, civil society organizations, if there's one element of the main tenets, and I know I'm simplifying now, right, of African cultures leadership, so communalism, role of elders, cultural preservation, oral cultures, anything else that I'm forgetting in this very moment, which, if you look at the nonprofits that you're exposed to, whether they're African nonprofits or whether they're American or other kind of global north NGOs, which of those leadership traits from the rich African leadership cultures do you think is most, are nonprofits that you're familiar with most in need of upholding or strengthening?
I will give you a straight answer: is communalism.
It is?
That's yes, because communalism, because everything else fell into place. The Ubuntu is part of that. Is you want the other person to feel like you are, the fact that you are in his life or her life is making it better. And you want to have, the empathy that I talk about, the integrity that I talk about, are all part of that communalism. So communalism is definitely the one that I will
The one
highlight.
that you would choose. Okay. It's been a rich discussion, Albert. So where can people go to find your book? And where can they go to find out more about you and the company that you're building, the consulting services in the geospatial area that you're developing, etc.?
So easy. My book is available on Amazon. So Amazon everywhere in the world. So
Talking about globalization.
yeah, any Amazon, you will have my book there. And find more about me, I have a very active LinkedIn page. So you just have to Google my name there, and also a very active Facebook page that is dedicated actually on leadership. We only talk about leadership in that official Facebook page.
That's
And so
like
you
a
just have to look at my name, Albert Anoubon Momo.
Okay, so we'll put those links in the show notes, people. And so you can start following Albert, because as you can hear in this interview, he has a lot of rich thoughts about global leadership and how it evolves, about the important contribution of African leadership cultures to our global thinking and practice around leadership. So I really recommend that. So with that, thank you, Albert, for all your insights and giving us so much food for thought. And thank you, listeners. If you found this podcast episode stimulating, guess what? There are others like it with other leadership doers, practitioners, and thinkers such as Adama Coulibaly and Charles Kojo van Dijk. Taka Awori is coming up as well soon. Martin Kalungu Banda is coming up with an episode. So there are many episodes that you can find in the podcast that focus on this, but there are also other topics. And you can find all of this on my website, fiveoaksconsulting.org, but also on my YouTube channel. One of the things that you can also find on the website is my newest offer. If you ever have the need for some advice, but you want an advisory call, but you do not right now have the time or budget for a longer term coaching, team coaching or consultation process, you can also book one-off advisory calls with me through my website. Subscribe to my email list to the website as well, and you will always be the first to hear when the next interesting podcast episode drops. So with that, I am saying goodbye for now. See you next time at NGO Soul and Strategy.